Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. Russia and its Western neighbors have a history of disagreement and violent confrontation, to say the least. The Russians never seem to learn from their past mistakes involving the Western powers, to their repeated detriment, time and time again. The Napoleonic Wars, the Crimean War, World War I, World War II, the collapse of the Soviet Union, and of course, the ongoing war in Ukraine. The common denominator is trust. Misplaced trust. Despite past experiences, Russia keeps making the same mistake in trusting Western leaders. But why is this? Why would the Russians ever trust a Western nation, especially the British, who have proven to be nothing but deceitful and hostile, leading to disastrous consequences for Russia? For the purpose of this video, I will start at the end of the 18th century, during the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars that followed. Before I proceed, however, I want to make a quick disclaimer. First of all, I greatly admire Russia and the Russian people. They have a fascinating history and culture. Their contribution to the world is unparalleled, and I myself identify as an Orthodox Christian. Therefore, this video is not to cause offense to any of my Russian subscribers and listeners. I'm simply pointing out some facts and observations. At the end of the 18th century, France is in turmoil, following the revolution and the execution of King Louis XVI. Napoleon seizes power a few years later and begins rolling back the insane policies of the Jacobins, who had been terrorizing France, killing tens of thousands. After he consolidates power, Napoleon finds himself against the British-led coalition, the second of which includes the Russian Empire. For the last 70 years, British Freemasonry had been spreading across Europe, undermining the sovereignty of nations and kingdoms, leading to fifth columns, manipulating monarchs and statesmen. The Rothschild banking family had managed to ensnare all the European kings and monarchs with debt, all except Napoleon, who had refused. This was unacceptable, so Britain, the center of international Jewish-owned finance and Freemasonry, put together a coalition of the major European powers in the first of many attempts to topple the French regime. Russia joined the alliance against France in 1799, but after a series of defeats, Tsar Paul I and Napoleon agreed on a peaceful settlement and began a rapprochement. Tsar Paul understood who the real enemy was and sought to cooperate with France, and even began planning a joint attack on the British in their most prized possession, India. A Franco-Russian expeditionary force invading overland would have struck a lethal blow to the British, who would not have been able to withstand such an attack, as India was left largely unguarded. This and the seizure of British merchant ships in St. Petersburg, effectively choking off British trade on the European continent, proved too much for London, and an assassination was ordered, which took place in 1801, allowing for Alexander I to replace Tsar Paul. Tsar Alexander was hostile to France and quickly reversed his predecessor's anti-British policies, and so France and Russia were once again at odds, which inevitably led to war. Although Russia defeated Napoleon and Russian troops marched into Paris a few years later, the cost was enormous, not only for France, but also for Russia. The war was completely unnecessary, as Paris and Moscow were at peace and working toward good relations under Tsar Paul. It was the British who ultimately were the beneficiaries of Europe's two most powerful countries destroying each other, as this enabled London to maintain control of trade on a divided continent. It's important to understand that Britain, although a major power, did not have the capability to invade, conquer, and hold Europe. As a sea power, going toe-to-toe against the major land powers was impossible. The British could carve out colonies in the global south, which had no way of resisting anyone that had firearms, but conquering an adversary on equal terms was never a possibility. This is why the British always had to rely on coalitions, something London could use its vast wealth to entice and attract would-be allies with. This and shrewd diplomacy. With France eliminated as a potential European hegemon, this left Russia as the number one power on the European mainland, which placed Moscow in Britain's crosshairs. The British have this obsession with controlling everything, and rather than cooperating with rival powers, they seek to undermine and destroy them. Despite Russia saving British interests in Europe at the cost of Russian blood, London made Moscow into their enemy, and so the 19th century became known as the Great Game between the British Empire and the Russian Empire. Sea power versus land power. Liberalism versus authoritarianism. With France conquered and Russia at a far enough distance, the British kept out of European wars for almost the entire 19th century, with the exception of the Crimean War. Less than 40 years after the Russians sacrificed hundreds of thousands of their own people for the British cause, they found themselves embroiled in a war on their own doorstep, this time against Britain, France, and their longtime rivals, the Ottomans. The British Empire had only gained in strength, making London more confident than ever, especially with their old rival France subdued. The purpose of this new confrontation was to contain Russia, which had been successful against the Ottomans in the Caucasus. The main objective was to remove Russian presence from the Black Sea and the Danube, and more importantly, to prevent Russia from threatening the Bosphorus and the Dardanelles, which were key to British diplomacy. A weak Ottoman Empire was preferable to a strong Russia. This was yet another British-led coalition, where Britain's allies did most of the fighting, as usual. The result was a humiliating defeat for Russia in 1856 at the Treaty of Paris. Despite this, just 58 years later, Russia sides with both France and England in World War I at enormous cost. Russia loses both the war against the Central Powers and its own civil war as a foreign entity sponsored by the British seizes control. The British had not only convinced Moscow to enter into a devastating war against Germany that posed absolutely no threat to them, but also poisoned the well with Marxism, which the British had exported to Russia for the purpose of destabilizing and ultimately overthrowing the Tsar. The Marxist revolutionaries were being sponsored by the British at the same time as London was convincing Moscow that they were friends and could be trusted, and that Germany was the real enemy. As the Soviet Union consolidated power, the West, sensing weakness, decided to side with the anti-Bolsheviks in order to encourage further chaos, preventing Russia from reasserting itself as a great power. This ultimately fails, and this new monstrosity, known as the USSR, simply usurps the Russian Empire and once again allows the British to convince them to die in huge numbers just over 2 decades later. Even after all of these lies and backstabbings, the Russians still failed to see who the real enemy was. After the chaos of the post-Soviet collapse in the 90s, when Western megacorporations were pillaging Russia, the new Putin-led government still thought it was possible to be on good terms with London and Washington, and even requested to join NATO, a logical step toward European security. Once again, we see Russian leadership extending an olive branch in good faith, hoping to finally establish a lasting peace and, God forbid, good terms and friendship. However, the Western leadership are not logical, and the opposite happened. Having failed to colonize Russia, and with Putin disrupting their feeding frenzy, ending the party, the Atlanticist West began working on a new war, which is ongoing to this day, with no end in sight. Despite the West losing, and with no hope of reversing the situation, they are doubling down and acting even more reckless than ever. There certainly seems to be some naivety and gullibility within the Russian mindset, perhaps some inferiority complex, or simply believing that each day is a new day, and if one acts in good faith, then there should be some reciprocity. Some vain hope that maybe the West will accept their proposals for good relations, if only they could see that they simply want peace. The past is the past. Let's move forward into a better world. This is very ideological thinking, and as we can see, not based in reality. You cannot reason with these people. The Anglo-American Atlanticist empire of liberalism simply cannot tolerate independent, non-liberal states if they can't exercise 100% control. It drives them mad, and they simply will not stop until their opponent is destroyed. There is no compromise, and there is no negotiating. submit or die. These are psychopaths that Putin is up against, yet somehow he is still hoping that they will listen to reason. 200 years has proven this, but those who fail to learn from history are determined to repeat it. Now we must consider a few things here. If we look at the geography of both Russia and Britain, there is great distance between them, allowing for a balance of power to be maintained. The reason for Russian leadership opposing less hostile powers and siding with the British is in part for self-preservation. It is in Russia's interest to prevent a major power on the continent, such as France once was, from becoming even more powerful, should Britain be neutralized. Having buffer states and keeping other major powers at a distance is perhaps what has motivated Russia into siding with the British against France and later Germany, even at the cost of their own national dignity. Sharing a land border with a rival power causes tensions and can lead to devastating wars. However, it seems that Russian leaders have failed to consider something crucial. It is uniquely British, and by extension American, to want to conquer the world. Despite everything we were told about Napoleon in France, Hitler in Germany, these two countries never sought to take over the world. That is pure projection by those who wrote the history books. No other European powers ever had this ambition, not since the Romans at least. Therefore, this is a blind spot in assuming that others think in the same way you do. It seems Russia has failed to understand this Anglo obsession, which has cost them in so many ways over the last 200 years. If you fail to identify your enemy, you lose. Russia's saving grace, however, is its size. It's simply too large to conquer fully. But Anglo greed knows no bounds, and won't stop until it succeeds or is itself destroyed. Therefore, as long as the Atlanticists maintain global hegemony, Russia will be their primary enemy, simply for existing as a regional power. Only one side will remain. At this point, the current Russian leadership absolutely understands that the Anglo-American Atlanticists are corrupted and rotten to the core, beyond any reasonable doubt. They have come to terms with the fact that there will be no negotiated settlement over Ukraine. Diplomacy is impossible with the irrational and reckless nature of DC and its European vassals. Furthermore, will the Russians acknowledge the other problem, something closer to home, which has historically caused them huge turmoil? Will Moscow accept the elephant in the room? Will they neutralize this demonic force before another neo-Bolshevik-led revolution destroys them? Or will they ignore it in the hope that it will somehow disappear, like an abusive relationship, where the abused makes excuses and keeps returning? Thanks for watching. If you like this content, please consider subscribing. Please also share and leave a like. It's free and it helps the channel. Also, a big thank you to all of you who have very kindly donated. I very much appreciate your generosity, as this channel is demonetized. For one-off donations, it's easy. I accept PayPal and Buy Me a Coffee, or even crypto. Links are in the description. Until next time.